Good evening and welcome to another great evening organised by Caroline and the Somerville London group. You are brilliant supporters and organisers in the London group, and it's very good to have another opportunity to spend an evening with Somervillians, albeit remotely. And it's a fantastic turnout this evening. I think we've got 118 people here. For me, it's a very special pleasure to be able to attend this evening's event, because when Julie came to Somerville last year, I had to miss her talk. I can't remember why, but I know that I was really sad and frustrated. I absolutely loved her book, including the dust jacket and the photos. We're proud of our entrepreneurs, our businessmen and women, public servants, medics, scientists, people working in international development, education, health, culture and the arts. But it's so fantastic to have a touch of glamour with an editor of Vogue. How wonderfully Somervillian that our very own editor of Vogue also chose to bring the realities of war to the attention of her readers. The photo by Cecil Beaton, Fashion is Indestructible, and the photos by the icon Lee Miller are truly extraordinary. As I sit here looking relatively smart from the top, but wearing my Converse instead of the heels that I'm usually addicted to, I wonder how Audrey would have portrayed life and fashion in this pandemic, and which writers and photographers she would have approached. Our links with Audrey are strong in so many ways, not least because Cornelia Sarabji was her godmother, and we house the remarkable collection of her father, Percy Williams' correspondence. But I have to say that without Julie's book, I would not have known just how amazing Audrey Withers was. I do so wish I'd known her, a woman with great determination, great talents and great values. I'm inordinately proud that she was a Somervillian. And I'm also very proud that Caroline is a Somervillian. And over to you, Caroline. This is your evening. Thank you for inviting me here.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jan. On behalf of all the Somerville London group, thank you to everyone for joining us this evening for our second online event. Before I introduce our speaker, Julie Summers, a small piece of housekeeping. You will see an Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. After Julie's finished speaking, I will be putting those questions to her. So do please use that and put any questions down there. And you can also vote for questions. So I will endeavour to pick the most popular questions to ask her. Julie has written 13 books, including Fearless on Everest, a biography of her great uncle, Stanley Irving, who died with malady on the top of the world in 1924. She has found a rich seam of inspiration in the Second World War and the extraordinary circumstances that people had to deal with then. Her book Jambusters, about the Women's Institute in the early part of the war, inspired the ITV drama series Holy Fires. She's speaking to us tonight about her most recent book, Dressed for War, the story of Audrey Withers, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about Audrey. So over to you, Julie.
Good evening, and really lovely to be here. What an honour. Could I possibly have my slide presentation, because I think it's easiest to talk with the lovely photographs. While those are coming up, just let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to be exploring Audrey's life, and particularly her relationship with Somerville, because it was a very strong and personal relationship with the college. First slide, please.
Hello. Sorry, I just thought I'd just pop in. Julie, I think you have Crowdcast open on more than one window. So if you just, possible? Yes, if you just double check.
How do I stop?
You've only got it on one tab.
How do I stop that?
Just have a look on your web browser tabs that are currently open.
I'm sorry?
Have a look at your web browser tabs that are currently open and just check that you've closed everything down except for the single Crowdcast one.
Oh, God. Okay, just a minute. So sorry. Is that all gone now?
Indeed, it has.
Oh, good. I'm very relieved. Thank you. I'm so sorry about that. That was a dreadful noise that was making. I do apologise to everybody who was trying to listen and being disturbed by it. So I'm going to talk tonight about Audrey Withers, and I particularly want to focus on her relationship with Somerville, because she was a very proud Somervillian. But if we can have the first slide, please, Jack. It's Mary Summers who was the real starter at Somerville. She was there 1889 to 90, having read ancient history at University College London. And she formed, as Jan told us, a very close relationship with Cornelius Sorabji. And so when she was encouraging Audrey to think about further education, she was obviously clear that Audrey should go to her old college. Next slide, please. Percy Withers was probably the biggest influence on Audrey's life, because Mary Withers was a very shy woman. She wasn't very good at expressing her emotions, but Percy was this extraordinarily vibrant and exciting character. He had trained as a GP in Manchester and was working as a GP when Audrey was born in 1905, and her older sister, her 5 years older sister, lived with him as well. And when Percy Withers was in his early 30s, he suffered from a terrible attack of bilateral pneumonia, which in the 1900s was going to kill anybody. And amazingly, he survived the disease, basically through the huge care of his two brothers who were doctors and Mary Withers, who nursed him back to health. He was unconscious for 6 weeks. And as a result of this, he could never work as a GP again. But he became an extraordinarily interesting man. He became a professional friend to the literati, and he was on very close terms with the poet, the poet laureate Robert Bridges. He was great friends with A.E. Houseman, who was by all accounts a very tricky character. And he had in his circle of friends artists, writers, poets, and all these people were around as young Audrey was growing up. Next slide, please. So she was born in Manchester, but her parents moved to Abbots Bay, this beautiful place on Derwent Water. And the next slide shows a bit more detail of the little house that they grew up in, the children. And it was an extraordinary existence. She lived like a little wild thing. She described herself as almost like an elf. She grew up understanding the rock plants and the trees around Derwent Water. And for 5 happy years, she and her sister Monica lived at Abbots Bay, where her father was working very part-time for the National Trust, looking after 2 woods around Abbots Bay. Next slide, please. But in 1910, her mother said to Percy that they really had to move back to what she described as mainland Britain because the children needed educating. Initially, Audrey went to a small boarding school in Woking, but in 1916, at the age of 11, she was sent up to St Leonard's School in Fife. And there, and here she is in the middle of this photograph in the hockey team, looking very sweet and energetic. There she had an extraordinary and wonderful education. Her headmistress was also her house mistress, a woman called Mary Bentinck Smith, who was an early suffragist. She was a feminist, and she told her girls that she saw no bar to anything a woman could do. And she was absolutely insistent that the girls should be as ambitious as if they were men. They shouldn't behave like men, but they should be as ambitious as possible. Next slide, please. And Audrey took part in all aspects of life at the school. She's seen here acting in Quality Street, a play by J.M. Barrie. And she did well academically. She was strong. She was good at English particularly, but she was very proficient in the ancient languages of Greek and Latin. And towards the end of her time at St Andrews, at St Leonard's, Mary Bentinck Smith suggested that she should consider applying to go to Somerville, which she duly did. By this time, the family was living in a beautiful house near Bicester, next slide please, called Solden Court. And Solden Court was a medieval house that had been altered in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it had a huge amount of accommodation, plenty of room for all Percy's friends. And it was these friends who were to go on and encourage Audrey to take the bold step and apply to go to Oxford. I mentioned Robert Bridges, the poet, and A.E. Houseman, but next slide, please. Probably the most important influence on Audrey's young life was the artist Paul Nash. He was a close friend of Percy Withers. He was impecunious, and Percy was regularly buying his etchings in order to keep Paul and his wife Bunty afloat. And Paul came up to Solden Court most months to come and see Percy Withers. And he met for the first time in 1920 the 15-year-old Audrey. And he was completely captivated by her, and she by him. Next slide, please. So over the course of the next 13 years, she was in a regular correspondence with Paul Nash. And it was the early letters that were really so important, because with her very buttoned up mother and her very eccentric father, Audrey really didn't have somebody she could confide in, try out ideas on, and really discuss her inner feelings and her inner thoughts. And with Paul Nash, she had a very willing and very amusing correspondent who allowed her, when she was at school, to try out her thoughts on anything from art to literature to music. And I show you this photograph of a letter that Paul wrote to Audrey in 1924 when she was about to go up to Oxford. And Audrey had described her anxiety of what she might wear when she got to Oxford. So Margaret Nash Bunty and Paul helped Audrey to find a wardrobe. And this is a sketch by Paul in one of his letters to her, imagining Audrey in her 1920s dress with a fan, looking rather coy with her hair over her eye. Next slide, please. Actually, Audrey didn't wear that dress when she had her photograph taken at Somerville. She was wearing as you can see her in the middle there, with a dress with a little bow around her neck. She was always quite self-conscious about her looks, because she was tall for her for the era. She was 5'10" in her stocking feet, and she had very pronounced teeth, which she always found slightly embarrassing, and she didn't like to be photographed. And there are actually very few photographs of her as a young girl. But here she is at Oxford, at Somerville, unbelievably happy to be away from the tyranny of the bells that signalled lessons and rules at school, and suddenly in this wonderful environment, reading English and feeling very much at home. And then at the end of the first term, she began to question whether it was sensible to be reading English, because she reasoned she would be able to read books for the whole of the rest of her life. And so she switched in February 1925 from English to PPE, which was a relatively new degree. It was introduced, I believe, in 1920 or 1921. And although politics and economics were taught at Somerville, she had to go to a man's college to do the philosophy. She would later describe the Oxford tutorial system as the best possible training she could have had to become an editor of a magazine like Vogue, where she was having to argue with some very tricky customers, not only photographers, but also designers. And she described the tutorial system as like an athlete preparing for a race. And I think that's probably not entirely incorrect from the era that she came from. So she had a marvellous time at Somerville. She spent a great deal of her evenings going to the Playhouse, which was just opposite, in what was the Big Game Museum and is now part of the language faculty. And she said she went to more plays than any other student. She had to go with another student. You couldn't go on your own. And so she had a rota of friends who she would go with, and she saw Ibsen and Strindberg. John Gielgud was part of the Oxford Repertory Company, and she developed a real passion for modern plays and modern music. Her favourite composer was Benjamin Britten. Next slide, please. I was rather thrilled when I found this document, which is the record of her time at Oxford and at Somerville. And as so often is the case, you've got all the information you need on that one page, including the reference to her two marriages, because if you see at the top of the page, it's Mrs. Kennett and Mrs. Stewart. But the key thing is that she graduated from Somerville in 1927 with a second-class degree in PPE. She was not at all happy not to have got a first, but everybody told her that it was very distinguished to have got that degree at all, and she could go to London and get a job with her head held high. And that was absolutely key to Audrey. Some of her other friends at Somerville were going to go home and work perhaps in the voluntary sector. Some of them were going to get married. But Audrey was absolutely clear that she was never going to rely on her parents to fund her life. She was absolutely determined that she would find her own career, and she would never have to ask anybody for money. And furthermore, she followed her uncle Harry Somers' advice that she would never marry for money. Next slide, please. So after 4 years working in London, she worked in the bookshop Bumpus on Oxford Street, where she worked doing jobs in the bound Bibles department, which she found eventually very boring. She applied for a job with out of the Evening Standard. It was just a job as a copy editor. And when she arrived for her interview at 1 New Bond Street, she discovered that she was being interviewed for the lowliest job at the famous fashion magazine Vogue. There's a rather sweet story that she told Paul Nash about being confused about what she should wear for her interview because she was not a fashionable person. And so she and her 3 flatmates divided up their clothes, and she wore one person's shoes and somebody else's skirt and another woman's blouse. And off she went to her interview, and there she was grilled by her interviewer, who was the managing editor of Vogue, and she was given the post as the most junior copy editor. The managing editor tragically contracted cancer 4 years after Audrey joined, and so Audrey was elevated to the position of managing editor in 1935. Now, this is an interesting role at a magazine like Vogue, because it's the role of organization. It's commissioning articles that the editor has decided she wants. It's liaising with photographers. It's making sure that all the billing is done correctly. So it's a very much an administrative role. But what it meant was that she began to get to work with some of the really famous Vogue characters. Cecil Beaton was the leading star as the photographer and writer at British Vogue, but she was also dealing with some of the great designers of the time. And she found the discipline of both organizing these extraordinary people and making sure that everything ran to time and to budget, truly a fascinating challenge. So 2 years into her managing editorship, she got to deal with one of the trickiest problems that came up in 1937, and that was the divorce of Wallis Simpson and the decision by Edward VIII to marry her. The parent company of Vogue in the US were over the moon that there was going to be a link between American heiress and the British royal family. The British royal family and the British press were absolutely horrified. And Audrey and her editor, Betty Penrose, had this tremendous tussle between London and New York about how they were going to feature Mrs. Simpson in the Vogue of June 1937. Next slide, please. In this particular edition, Audrey was featuring some of the really beautiful designs coming out of Paris. Most fashion was still dictated by Paris in those days, and this is a Molyneux on the right and a Lanvin on the left. And these spreads would have come from Paris, and all Audrey would have had to do was to caption them. So the managing editor's role was to caption the photographs. Next slide, please. The row between London and New York bubbled on for many days, and there were telegrams flying backwards and forwards between the offices. But in the end, Audrey and Betty Penrose persuaded the Americans that to run a 6-page article on Mrs. Simpson would really be too much for the British. So here is the single spread of Mrs. Simpson, photographed in 1936 by Cecil Beaton. And as you can see, there's just a very short caption: "Chateau background of the Duchess of Windsor, photographed by Beaton." And I really had the feeling when I read that caption that Audrey almost had to hold her nose in order to get Mrs. Simpson into the magazine. So terribly was she disapproved of in the English press. Next slide, please. I mentioned Betty Penrose, who was the editor of Vogue in the second half of the 1930s. She was American, and she'd been appointed by the American office to bring some discipline to the British Vogue, which was affectionately known as Brogue, because British Vogue had been losing money hand over fist. They simply hadn't got the advertising revenue. And Betty was successful in sharpening up the content of British Vogue, and Condé Nast and Edna Woolman Chase were very pleased with her work. And in March 1940, she applied to go back to the States to visit her family. So the war had broken out in September 1939, and it was the phony war. Nothing was really going on, although it was about to hot up and get very dangerous. So Betty Penrose went back to the States, ostensibly for a month's vacation, and left Audrey in charge as the acting editor. Well, over the course of the summer of 1940, we had the Blitzkrieg, the Battle of Britain, and then, of course, the start of the Blitz. And Betty Penrose simply couldn't get back. She was fearful of the war in the Atlantic, and her sponsors in America, Edna and Condé Nast, really felt it wasn't a sensible thing to send her back to London. So on the 25th of September, 1940, a few days into the Blitz, Audrey, seen here wearing a hat in the bomb cellar of No. 1 New Bond Street, was appointed editor of British Vogue. And from the moment the Blitz started, she was determined that their magazine was going to get out come hell or high water. She was not going to be cowed by the German bombing. And so here she is, as you can see, in the bomb cellar, which is below No. 1 New Bond Street. She's talking to her art editor. She's got a couple of secretaries with their typewriters. And to her left is the art editor's assistant with his sticky tape and his glue and his photographs. And they put together the October, November and December issues of Vogue in the bomb cellar of No. 1 New Bond Street. Next slide, please. The offices were hit in November, and as a result, the December issue was 2 days late. And she photographed, or she got Lee Miller to photograph the state of the offices. The actual building wasn't too badly damaged, but all the windows were blown out, and Burlington Arcade opposite was completely damaged beyond belief. And she wanted to have this spread in Vogue to persuade her readers that despite everything that the Germans were throwing at London, they were going to carry on and be determined. And one of the captions says, "Vogue, like Londoners, goes to bed in a cellar." And it was a real message from Audrey that it was not a good idea to give up. She was determined to bring the war into her readers' lives. And particularly, she was keen to bring the war into her American readership's lives. So this spread was single-page spread, was reproduced in American Vogue with a long article by Audrey describing how the magazine was carrying on in the face of the Blitz. Next slide, please. There was a degree of lightness that she wanted to bring in, because the war was a terrifying and terrible thing, and especially in the early years when really people didn't know if the Allies were going to prevail. And so this is the swatches of colour and material that were designed for the autumn of 1940, and she's got them designed as barrage balloons, and there's a sort of woolly cutout of the profile of the silhouette of London. So she wasn't entirely serious. She liked a bit of levity, a bit of frivolity, but when she wanted her readers to understand the seriousness of something, she didn't take it lightly. She was very, very clear. Next slide, please. And this was particularly my favourite photograph of her in charge in 1944, photographed by Norman Parkinson. It was at the height of her power as the editor. And you can see behind her, she's got the spreads of this month's Vogue. And then to her right, the spreads of next month's Vogue, which would be being peopled as the weeks went along. And she always had those on battens, both behind her desk and behind the managing editor's desk. And they would change, and they were flexible. So if somebody wrote a particularly powerful piece, they could move the features around. And I was rather enchanted when I went into the Vogue offices recently to discover that Edward Enninful has not bulldog clips, but nevertheless his spreads of today's Vogue out on battens, but behind a blind. So you have to be very privileged if you're allowed to see what's coming up in the future. But Audrey was very open about this. People could come into her office and discuss what was going to be in the edition, but they couldn't influence her. And one of the things that the designers tried to do, particularly Edward Molyneux, who'd come over from France in 1940, they tried to influence Audrey as to which of their models of the gowns or outfits they were going to allow to be shown in Vogue. And Audrey was having nothing of it. Her magazine was entirely independent, and her job was to keep it that way. And however much she was badgered by the designers, by the Ministry of Information and by the War Office, she always towed her own line. Next slide, please. I mentioned her star photographer, Cecil Beaton. He had been with Vogue since 1925 and had initially been an illustrator, and then he started photography. He had a box Brownie originally, but Condé Nast persuaded him to get a bigger camera. And there'd been a terrible incident in early 1938 when Beaton had been asked to do an illustration for American Vogue, and he had introduced an anti-Semitic note into this illustration. It was tiny, you could barely see it without a magnifying glass, but the damage was done. And he was sacked from all Vogues in January 1938 and was reeling with shock from the impact of this. But he came back to Britain with his tail very much between his legs. And it wasn't until 3 months into the war when Condé Nast realised that he'd punished Beaton for nearly 2 years and how much he needed Beaton to be involved, that Beaton was reinstated as one of the photographers. And so Audrey was allowed to use him again, and she did so with great effect. Next slide, please. Jen mentioned this very famous photograph, which he took in May 1941 after the bombing of the Temple. And it's called Fashion is Indestructible, and it is just one of those iconic photographs from the Second World War. And it was always assumed that it was Beaton who'd gone out with a model and had made this magnificent shot. Next slide, please. But when I was doing the research for the book, I was very lucky to get to New York and read archive papers at the Condé Nast archives. And part of my research was desperate seeking for Audrey's own words and own writing, because there was so little in London, which I'll explain in a moment. And while I was there for my second visit, the archivist came up to me and she said, I found a box that was never archived when the papers of Condé Nast and Edna Woolman Chase were sorted 10 years ago. Would you like to have a look in this box? And I opened the box and I realized that what this box contained were 4 ring-bound folders of memos between Edna Woolman Chase's office and Audrey's office from the period 1940 to 1947, which had never been archived, they'd never been looked at, and they were in such beautiful condition, I don't think they'd even been read since 1947. And in amongst these papers, there was memo 632, which told me that Audrey had commissioned that photograph. I had long wanted to get Cecil Beaton to do a photograph of a smart girl against some such background. And it was a moment of absolute revelation to me. I was so excited because it showed me that Audrey was more than just a good wordsmith. She had a brilliant eye for design, and she really knew what a powerful photograph could do to tell their story. Next slide, please. So Beaton photographed for her. He wrote articles for her over the course of the next few months of the war. And this is a photograph he took when she sent him up with the blessing of the Ministry of Information to work on an RAF airbase. And he wrote a beautiful article called The Knights of the Sky, which described to her readers the extraordinary bravery, but also the great humility of the fighter pilots who had fought in the Battle of Britain and who were still flying missions now over to Germany in 1941. And this is one of the lovely photographs that he took. And he had that extraordinary ability to capture a mood and an essence that Audrey really appreciated. It was such a powerful image for her to show these young men from below. Next slide, please. But she had a big struggle because the Minister of Information was so impressed with Beaton's work that they decided they would send him out to Africa and the Middle East, and then later to China and India, where he was asked to photograph the war, but not the war itself, but the impressions of the war. And this is an extraordinary picture he took of a wreckage of an aeroplane. I don't know what aeroplane it is, but it might even have been a German plane. But he was very interested in what that told you about the prosecution of the war. And Audrey published these photographs along with his reports in Vogue. Next slide, please. Now, just before he went out to India, which was a trip that was to last 14 months, so Audrey would be without her star photographer, he and Audrey did something so dreadful that I almost haven't really ever forgiven her, but it was for all the right reasons. In March 1942, Audrey Withers and Cecil Beaton destroyed the entire paper and photographic archive of British Vogue. They did it for the paper salvage effort. But oh my goodness, What a tragedy for history. And this is why I was so thrilled when I found those magnificent memos in New York, because I had Audrey's voice and I had Audrey's war, which she and Beaton had destroyed. Next slide, please. The Vogue front covers for the war were all sent over from America. It wasn't until the late 1940s, early 1950s that Audrey was able to design her own covers. And this is my favorite one, which you will recognize we used as the front cover of the book. It's a photograph by John Rawlings. It's obviously influenced by Manet, but look at the side: wardrobe planning, coupons, fabrics, renovations. They were really struggling to find anything exciting to write about in terms of design and fashion. The number of outfits that were allowed by 1943, when this photograph was taken, had been vastly reduced. Clothes rationing came in 1941, and austerity was the dictate of design for the utility clothing scheme. And the austerity regulations were designed by Hardy Amis and Audrey Withers, and that limited the number of buttons on a dress or on a jacket to 3. Men's trouser turn-ups were banned, which was very unpopular. The length of men's socks were prescribed, and skirts had to be above the knee, and ruched sleeves were out, and so forth. So Audrey had, with Hardy Amis, had pared down design to absolutely minimal amounts, and both she and Hardy Amis believed that it had done British fashion a great deal of good. Next slide, please. This is a photograph by Norman Parkinson, one of her other photographers who worked for her during the war. And it's a photograph taken on his farm of a utility shoot. So the woman in the photograph is wearing a pair of utility dungarees, and the 2 little boys are also wearing utility clothes. And Norman Parkinson was very useful for her because he was an exceptionally lively and interesting photographer, and he could make these images on his farm look as if they were just a moment away from a slip in the mud. And it made her work trying to show utility clothing to her readers much easier. Next slide, please. But the greatest relationship that Audrey had during the Second World War was with this extraordinary woman, Lee Miller. Lee Miller was a former model of Vogue. She was a photographer. She learnt her trade through working with Man Ray, who was also her lover, in the 1930s. And by 1940, she was living in London, deeply frustrated that she couldn't take part in the war because she hadn't got press accreditation. And over the course of the first 2 years of the war, she photographed for Audrey. She photographed women's forces and services. She photographed models. She photographed utility. But in 1942, Audrey was able to get her war accreditation because she was an American. And in 1944, Lee managed to get out to an American camp behind the lines in Normandy. And Audrey encouraged her not only to photograph, but also to write. And this began the most extraordinary partnership between Audrey, who edited everything that Lee sent back to her, and Lee, who got under the skin of the war and really managed to produce some of the most extraordinary copy and the most wonderful and captivating and devastating photographs. I'm not allowed to show you the Lee Miller archive photographs because they're limited by copyright. But there is Lee on the front of her son's book at San Marlo. She went there to photograph the piece, but unfortunately the intelligence was wrong, and she ended up right in the middle of a battle. And she found that thrilling, and she wrote to Audrey to say, "I've got gunpowder up my nose and I love it. I have my own private war." And she wrote this extraordinary 4,000-word article, which Audrey reproduced in Vogue in October 1944. Lee then went on through Paris. She spent 3 months in Paris after the liberation of France. She then went to Alsace, and she was there at the Operation Nordwind campaign, again photographing for Audrey. And then in April 1945, she went to Ohrdruf, and then to Buchenwald, and then finally, one day after it was liberated, to Dachau. And the impact of that, of course, was devastating. She was absolutely sickened by what she saw. And in Altdorf, she wrote to Audrey a telegram saying, I don't photograph this. But when she got to Buchenwald, she felt she had to record something. And interestingly, when Audrey saw the photographs, which came back from Germany with a big message on it from Lee saying, I beg you to believe this is true, she almost faltered. They were so gruesome and so awful. But in the end, she steeled herself and she reproduced in the Victory issue, the June 45 issue, a photograph of a pile of bodies by Lee Miller in that issue. She was the first British magazine editor to reproduce a photograph from a concentration camp. There is a link to this photograph, which Jack and Dave have got, and you can follow it. But I have to warn you, it's a deeply disturbing picture. And years later, Audrey was very angry with herself that she didn't produce more of Lee's photographs from Dachau. But actually, in the end, she said they were just too shocking and the war was too raw, and her readers had had enough of the war and they wanted to focus on the future. Next slide, please. So over the summer of 1946, Audrey was involved in a very exciting new venture, which was an exhibition that was going to showcase British design of the present and of the future, and to give the British public something to hope for, something hopeful to look at. And there was this exhibition of which Audrey was the head of the design and fashion team, called Britain Can Make It. Next slide, please. It was seen by, so here she is with Henry Moore, with his back to you, and Anne Scott James in the leather chair, and Audrey to Anne Scott James's right. And there they are looking at Henry Moore drawing. He was designing scarves for the exhibition, and she's very much the editor in charge here. And it was she who wrote the catalogue for the exhibition, and it was she and Anne Scott James, who was the editor of Harper's Bazaar, who made the selection of the fashion that would be shown in the exhibition. Next slide, please. The exhibition was fantastically well received. There were 1.5 million visitors to the exhibition over the space of 6 weeks. And as you can see, they were all queuing madly to see it. And if we see the next slide, you can see a selection of Audrey's choice of designs. These are Hardy Amis and Digby Morton. They're still utility. So you can see the skirts are still short and the minimal number of buttons, but the woman in the middle is wearing a fur coat. So there is a nod to the future. Next slide, please. By 1948, Audrey had been in charge of British Vogue for 8 years. She's photographed here by the American photographer Clifford Coffin in her boss Harry Yoxall's office. And Harry Yoxall loved cats. There's a cat behind her, which I always thought is rather a nice little detail. And she was absolutely in charge of British Vogue. But what happened is the Americans wanted to take back control, and she was having none of it. She'd run Vogue during the war, and she was absolutely clear that she was going to go on keeping her Vogue moving in the direction of travel, which was to describe the whole woman, not just the fashion and the clothes. But she had articles by Daphne du Maurier, for example, on literature. She had artists. She featured Henry Moore and Graham Sutherland and Benjamin Britten. And she wanted her readers to be as educated in the widest possible sense as she could. Next slide, please. In 1951, she was on the board of the Festival of Britain, where she worked on with people on the design side of things. There was no fashion at the Festival of Britain, but she was still very much involved. She'd been appointed after Britain Can Make It to the Council for Industrial Design. And in 1953, she chaired the Coronation Souvenirs Committee, and she was very disappointed in the quality of the souvenirs that were produced. So design was very much a big thing in her life, but it was always her magazine that she was so proud of. Next slide, please. And she wanted to bring some energy and some movement into the magazine. And this is one of my favorite spreads from 1956. It's called Good Suit, Bad Posture. And she was trying to just introduce some more energy, some movement. And next slide, please. You'll see that here she's really got something going. It's a photograph by her discovery. Anthony Armstrong drones, later Lord Snowdon. And if you look at the photograph carefully, they are embracing and a glass is falling off the table. And I think it's one of those most joyous photographs from that era. Next slide, please. This is Audrey taken by Snowdon in 1960, the year of her retirement from Vogue. She's still looking very much the energetic editor, completely white-haired by now, with her string of pearls that Edna Woolman Chase had given her after the war in 1945, and as ever, Vogue behind her on the boards. But she felt she was out of tune with where Vogue was going. There was more interest in fashion, less interest in features, and so she decided to step aside. And I was so very pleased to find from Harry Yoxall, her managing director's diary, that she wasn't pushed. She actually decided to leave of her own volition. And that was very important to me because so many Vogue editors got fired. But Audrey was just in tune enough with the world of fashion that she knew it was time to hand over the reins. And she handed over to Ailsa Garland, who ran Vogue for 4 years. Next slide, please. Audrey disappeared to some extent into the shadows, mainly because her second husband very much wanted her to be more part of his life. He wasn't keen on her having another job. And so she stopped work in 1960, age of 55, and did a lot of traveling with Victor Kennett, her Russian-born husband. And he died in 1980 at the old age of 86. And suddenly Audrey had some time on her hands, and she got back in touch with Somerville because she was very keen to place her father's valuable archive with the college. And she told Miss Park, Daphne Park, that what she really wanted to do was to write a book about her father's time as a friend of the literati. And then in this letter, which she wrote in November 1984, she wrote, "I began to realise that I had a great aversion to looking back at my life or revisiting, even in thought, scenes of the past." And I think that's very revealing of Audrey. She was always a woman who looked forward. She was in search of something new and exciting all her life. And even into her 80s and 90s, she was interested in the world around her. And when she could no longer go out into the world, she brought the world into her flat in London through newspapers, through Radio 3. She used to go to concerts where she could at the Wigmore Hall. And she was constantly and always longing to meet new people and talk about new experiences. Next slide, please. Her last job was working for the SDLP as the volunteer membership secretary, and she did that for 10 years from 1980 to 1990, which is just before this lovely photograph of her was taken shortly before her 94th birthday. And I think what was so wonderful about this was that she was there from the age of 75 to over 85, working for the SDLP, absolutely loving it, working with young people who were the sort of secretaries around on the ground, and they all found her totally energetic and fascinating. And at one stage, when she'd been there for almost 10 years, they decided between them that they really ought to see if they could get Audrey a gong. And she heard about this and she roared with laughter and she said, "Oh, but didn't you know I've already got one? I got one in 1953. And it was typical of Audrey that she wasn't going to boast about her past. They all knew she'd been the editor of Vogue, but that's all they knew about her. They simply knew her as Audrey. So she lived until 2001, a very venerable age of 96. And she had right up until the very end of her life, her curiosity and her sense of humour and her brilliant capacity to make friends with people right across the generations, which I honestly believe is the legacy of Percy Withers insisting that she and her sister Monica should, right from an early age, get on with adults and talk to adults and address adults and explore ideas. And that is what Audrey did for the whole of the rest of her life. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to hand over to Caroline to see if there are any questions. But thank you so much for listening. And I apologise for the awful technical problem at the beginning.
Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Julie. That was fantastic. Really enjoyed that. So many interesting things and absolutely fascinating the way she worked with the different photographers and destroying the archives. Just terrible, but understandable in the circumstances, but very frustrating for you. So we've got some fantastic questions for you. So if we start with actually one about archives, where do you begin to research for a biography like this? And do you think special access is a precondition for good biography writers?
That's a really good question. I think, so with this book, I started at Somerville. Because actually your archives are fantastic, and it's not just the Percy Withers archives, but it's the good material you have around your alumni. And I read the Fritillary, which was very engaging, and so I found out about what plays had been shown at the Playhouse, and I read about the hockey team. She was in the second hockey team, so there was really good information there. And then I moved to Vogue, and then I went to Condé Nast. I read a lot of other biographies of the people she worked with, because she's always mentioned peripherally. If you read Beaton's biography by Hugo Vickers, there she pops up.
Yeah.
She's there in Lee Miller's work. I think the great good luck find I had was in finding those memos, and the marvelous archivist at the Condé Nast archive in New York. She was so brilliant, and she gave me total privileged access to those papers, and it just made it. I couldn't have written a book with the same authority without those marvelous papers.
Yeah, fantastic. More question. Now, next question. Was there any censorship on the contents of Vogue during the war? And if so, how did Audrey manage that?
Well, that's a really good question. There was censorship of the photographs. So they were all photographs apart from fashion shoots, unless they were like the one that Cecil took. All photographs had to go through the censor. And that was a big problem with the Lee Miller photographs, particularly the one she took of St. Malo, because the Americans used napalm at St. Malo.
Yeah.
So that was a bit troublesome. And Lee photographed this, and all Audrey knew was it was some extraordinary new weapon, but she didn't know what it was. And so those photographs were banned. There was no censorship of the written word at all. She was lobbied very hard by the various government departments, including particularly the Board of Trade, also the Ministry of Information and the Ministry of Food, who wanted her to get their message over. And by and large, she did it in her own way. So there was a message in 1942 that women should have their hair cut short because there'd been some terrible scalping, hideous scalping.
Yeah.
And so what Audrey did was she got two famous actors of the time, Coral Brown and another whose, of course, name has escaped me, Carol Kerr, and Deborah Kerr, they were photographed with their hair short. Lee Miller also had her hair cut short, and she used Lee Miller's solarizing technique in order to make the photographs stand out very beautifully. And it was a good feature, and so it was less Ministry Information blurb and really more style, and that was the kind of way she would allow the Ministry of Information to ask her to influence women.
Yeah. Right. And the question about how did she work, her style of working and influence in such a male-dominated world?
Well, it's really interesting because the women's magazines were predominantly run by women. She had a managing director called Harry Oxford, who was a wonderful character, actually. He ran Condé Nast Publications, but she had an entirely female workforce at Vogue. Wow. There were 17 of them. And then but obviously most of the photographers apart from Lee were men, and most of the designers apart from Elspeth Champcommunal were men as well. She would always argue that the tutorial system had given her frankly the courage to stand up against men. I think her parental influence, particularly her father's influence, and as I mentioned, her getting to pit her wits against Paul Nash and R.L. Griggs and all these other characters, I think that was quite formative of her in her sort of early time. But it was Mary Bentinck Smith's assertion that there's nothing a woman shouldn't be able to do as well as a man. It just guided her, and she appointed women who were married, women with children. Her beauty editor had
shocking, yes,
but great stuff, and she just was determined that was the way to run her office. And when she once was briefly unemployed, she was given some money by her uncle Harry Summers, and she hated it. She just hated the fact that she had to depend upon somebody else, and that somebody else had to be a man.
So that ties in with another question we've had, which is how a woman like Audrey managed to marry a man who didn't want her to work.
Yes, well, we have our problems with them. Is anybody there in the room related to Victor Kennett? I hope not. So she married an incredibly handsome chap called Jock Stewart in 1933. And in 1938, she met Victor Kennett, who was a Russian emigre. And Victor had just completely fallen for Audrey and begged her to leave Jock. And she didn't. And she stayed married to Jock until 1952, when finally Jock's affairs, he looked like Rex Whistler, he was madly handsome looking. And so she decided to leave Jock, and Victor reappeared in her life, and she married him. There's something very odd. And I think, if I'm absolutely honest, I don't think she could admit that she had made a mistake in marrying a man who was so controlling. Because initially, she loved being married to him because he was very attentive. He used to, come over to Vogue House every evening to pick her up from work, it's something
that's a bit much.
It wasn't her style. And some of the staff who was young girls then, remember looking out the window and seeing sort of Victor standing there waiting for him and finding it slightly creepy.
Very.
I think sadly she just did not. And she had very bad back problems in the 1960s. And part of that, she ended up by being sectioned by Victor because he thought she was a hypochondriac. The whole thing is a very sad story, that part of the book. I've never managed to find anybody who's prepared to talk to me about Victor in great detail. But they did go to Russia 11 times when it was still behind the Iron Curtain. So there was something a bit strange going on there. And I think she knew that she was being controlled by him. But she'd made her mind up to live with him, and that's what she did.
Yeah. Look at the other question. Do you think tutorials still prepare you for the challenges of a career?
Well, I didn't go to Oxford, so I can't necessarily tell you that, but I am the Royal Literary Fund Fellow at St Hilda's, and I certainly think that some of the particular politics students who I get to see, they get given a pretty hard time in their tutorials. So I'm sure it does. I mean, it's an incredible system, and I think the weekly essay and the discipline is something that is really, really valuable. And you can't gainsay that.
Yes, no, I would agree. Was Audrey working with a boss to influence the Vogue remit in terms of the news side as well as the fashion side? I mean, you mentioned the chat. Was it the managing director of the States?
Yeah. So yes and no. So Harry Yoxall was the sort of conduit between America and London, because he'd worked for Condé Nast in New York in the 1920s, and then he came to London and ran Brogue, as it was known. And so when Edna Woolman Chase, who was the editor-in-chief in America, got shirty with Audrey, and there was a terrible row in 1946, and Audrey absolutely would not back down. When that happened, Harry Yoxall stood up for Audrey because he could see that her Vogue was successful. It got very good reviews. It was making money, which was great. It had a good war, which is a slightly embarrassing thing to say about a fashion magazine, but it made a lot of money during the war. And he really believed that she was steering the magazine in the right direction, and he gave her a free hand.
That's great, thank you. What were her anxieties about dress coming to Oxford, and are the letters between her and Nash accessible?
So this is Audrey doing terrible things. Audrey destroyed most of the letters from her to Paul Nash. She had them transcribed in 1954, and they were 13,000 words. And I know this because I have seen so many references to it. But the Somerville archive only has the letters from Nash to Audrey. And so she was covering her traces, but there's enough reference. And he very often quotes, when he's replying to her, he very often quotes her letters. And he said, "You said this." Right. And he gives it. And so they are accessible. They're at Somerville, and they're wonderful and hugely engaging and entertaining. And he's very affectionate. He calls her "my dear baby elephant," with people blundering around. But what's interesting, there's no sign at all that there was an inappropriate relationship. There was a 16-year age gap between them. And he used to visit her in London when she was working for Bumpers. He wrote for Vogue during the Second World War. But when she married her first husband, Jock, Paul Nash disappeared. He literally disappeared off the radar. He wrote a one-liner saying, "Good luck, yours, Paul, and that was it, and disappeared out of her life.
Yeah.
And so, I think he was very much very fond of her and probably slightly in love with her.
Yes. Do we know what she was like to work for?
Yes, I've talked to several people who worked with her, and these were all girls who were very young because they're now in their 80s and 90s, and all of them said that she was very democratic. She would listen to views, but in the end, she had Vogue as her first priority, and if she had to ride over somebody's opinion, she would do so, but she'd do so very gently. She was very kind to the young girls, and one of them, Pam Makin, who I've spoken to, said one of the reasons she admired Audrey so much was because Audrey was very gracious about the fact that she too had started at the bottom, and she wanted to encourage young women to find their feet, find their voice, and find their confidence to go on and do other things. And years later, Pam went to see her. So Pam must have been in her 50s and Audrey was in her 90s. And Pam realised that Audrey knew all the office gossip. She knew exactly who was sleeping with who, but she decided as editor to rise above it at the time. And so Pam said she was always very graceful and gracious and slightly aloof, but she had that wicked smile and delicious sense of humour, which occasionally would come out, and they all loved working for her. They really admired her.
So she was helping other women on the sort of same career path then?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there was one moment when one advertising executive started sexually harassing one of her secretaries, and she hauled this man into her office and she basically sacked him. And she said, wow, you do not mess with my girls. And if the man had gone on, she was going to take him to court. So she was
really? Yeah.
No nonsense.
And I think this is our final question. She progressed very quickly at Vogue. What roles did she hold, and where did her confidence come from?
So she held 3 roles. She was sub-editor, managing editor, and then editor. Her confidence came partly from Oxford. She would always say that was given her such a good grounding, and I think partly from her father, who was this extraordinary character, and she loved him, and she shared his passion for life, and she would describe herself as feeling like champagne bubbling up inside her. She was very young when she took over Vogue. She was 34, and she just felt she could do it. And she did, and that's a confidence.
That's great. I think we've just about come to the end of the question. Do you think it will be harder for future biographers to access personal information because we don't write letters and notes anymore?
Yes, I think it's going to be very, very tricky. And of course, we all write billions of emails, and who is going to have the courage to sort of wade through people's old inboxes? I don't know how it's going to work. I think there will be a lot more emphasis on people's voices in social media, which will be a bit strange. But there'll be also, I think, people will be looking more at relationships with other people and their recollections of people. But I think it's a really, really difficult problem that we're all going to have to deal with as biographers.
Yes. Yes, because things probably won't be, or potentially not even accessible electronically anymore.
Yeah.
And a comment here about and being amazed to read how each copy of Vogue was shared with at least 10 more families, and how such a glamorous magazine can make an impact on ordinary women in the war.
Yes, she did. Survey done how many readers were using Vogue, and it turned out that the readership of Vogue was 80,000 copies per month during the war, and the readership was between 1.8 and 2 million readers.
Wow,
that's astonishing.
That is fantastic. That is fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Julie. It's been an absolutely fascinating talk, and a big thanks also to Dave and Jack in the back room, who have been sorting out all any technical issues. So it's been a really fascinating evening. Thank you all for joining us, and now I'm handing back to Jan.
Thank you very much indeed. I think all the comments in the chat say it all. It was a wonderful evening. It was a great talk, Julie, and you've been a fantastic chair, Caroline. Thank you. And Audrey Withers. I mean, what an amazing woman. Courageous, energetic, determined, a real Somervillian, I would say. And I loved her mantra that there's nothing that a woman can't do. True then and true now. So it's always a real pleasure to work with the Somerville London group on these fantastic events, bringing fascinating talks by expert speakers to Somervillians all over the world. And these are very testing times, so it becomes especially important that we can be brought together, although not with the physical presence that we would prefer. So all the at-home event series have been very well attended. And being virtual has had its virtues in that we reach a very wide audience. But of course, the provision and delivery of these events come at a cost to Somerville, and we desperately want to keep offering them to you, but we also want to use better technology. And if I might say so, a little bit less brown paper and string, because Dave and Jack do a phenomenal job, but quite often they are having to sort of paddle like ducks in the background. So as part of our fundraising efforts to meet the COVID impacts of the college, we have established a digital fund project. And if you would like to support these events, connecting the entire Somerville family, from prospective students to current students to alumni, ensuring that everything we can do is truly inclusive, then of course we would welcome any contribution that you might be willing to make. Because all of these people that we are wanting to assist now, they are all these athletes who really are preparing for the race. And that's what all Somervillians here have done, and we want that to continue. So I think that there is a button on our screen, which may already have been there, but it's going to magically appear now if it hasn't appeared already. And we would be immensely grateful for any support that you can offer. It would be hugely appreciated. And we look forward to seeing you at some future events. And we've got lots and lots of wonderful plans up our sleeve for the coming months, because unfortunately, whilst we would love to welcome you all back to Somerville in the next few months, I fear that's not going to be possible. So we'll have to keep meeting like this, having tremendous events which bring us all together to celebrate being Somervillians. So thanks again to our speakers, to the London group, to Caroline for hosting the event. It's been a tremendous evening, and we go away with great pride in being a Somervillian. So thank you and good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.